I met Wayne at Sarah's 26th birthday dinner in 2012, and honestly, he wasn't even supposed to be there. Sarah had invited her coworker's younger brother as a last-minute addition when someone else canceled. And there he was, this sweet, slightly awkward 23-year-old engineer who kept asking thoughtful questions and actually listened to my answers. Most guys my age were still figuring out how to do their own laundry. But Wayne had this quiet confidence about him, like he already knew exactly who he was and where he was going. I was 25 and so tired of dating men who treated relationships like a hobby they'd pick up and drop whenever something shinier came along. Wayne was different. He texted when he said he would, showed up on time, remembered things I told him. When he asked me out for coffee 3 days later, he'd already researched the place to make sure they had the oat milk lattes I'd mentioned liking. It was such a small thing, but it felt like he was actually paying attention to me as a person, not just trying to get me into bed. Our first year together felt like everything I'd been waiting for. Wayne would pick me up after work with my favorite Thai food when I'd had a rough day, and he never once complained when I wanted to watch reality TV instead of his documentary suggestions. He introduced me to hiking, which I'd never thought I'd enjoy, but there was something magical about those weekend mornings when it was just us and the trail and no pressure to be anyone other than who we were. When he suggested I move in with him after we'd been dating for a year, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Living together was even better than dating. Wayne was considerate without being suffocating, organized without being controlling, and he genuinely seemed to enjoy building a life with me. We fell into this comfortable rhythm of shared meals and weekend projects and lazy Sunday mornings that felt like the foundation of something real and lasting. I'd watch him making his precise grocery lists or carefully measuring coffee grounds and think about how lucky I was to have found someone so steady and reliable. The proposal came during one of our hiking trips in 2016. At this overlook we'd been to dozens of times before. Wayne had been acting nervous all morning, checking his backpack obsessively and suggesting we take breaks every half mile. When we reached the summit and he got down on one knee with this simple, perfect ring, I started crying before he even finished his little speech about wanting to spend the rest of his life making me happy. It wasn't some elaborate production or social media moment. It was just us and this promise we were making to each other. And it felt absolutely right. Planning our wedding was one of those experiences that could either bring couples together or tear them apart. And for us, it was definitely the former. Wayne let me make most of the aesthetic decisions while handling all the logistics and vendor communications, which played perfectly to both our strengths. He never once complained about the cost or rolled his eyes at details that mattered to me. And I loved watching him get genuinely excited about things like the playlist and the cake tasting. Our wedding day felt like this beautiful celebration of everything we'd built together, surrounded by people who were genuinely happy for us. The first few months of marriage were basically an extension of our engagement. We were happy, settled, talking about the future in concrete terms. Wayne had gotten a promotion that came with a significant raise, and I was finally feeling established in my career. So when we started talking about starting a family in early 2017, it felt like perfect timing. We'd always talked about having kids someday, and someday suddenly felt like now. I went off birth control in March, and we were both so optimistic about the whole thing. Wayne started researching car seats and reading parenting books, and I downloaded all these apps to track my cycle and started taking prenatal vitamins. When I got pregnant in May, we were over the moon. Wayne immediately started baby-proofing the house and talking about converting the spare room into a nursery. We spent hours looking at paint colors and crib designs, planning this whole future around this tiny person we couldn't wait to meet. The miscarriage at 8 weeks was devastating, but everyone told us it was common and not to worry, that it didn't mean anything was wrong. Wayne was incredibly supportive, taking time off work to be with me and handling all the medical appointments and insurance calls while I recovered emotionally. When we got pregnant again in August, we were more cautious but still hopeful. This time we made it to 10 weeks before losing the baby, and the doctor started talking about running tests and looking into potential causes. The third miscarriage in November broke something in both of us. I remember lying in the hospital bed afterward, watching Wayne try not to cry while he filled out paperwork, and feeling like my body had betrayed not just me, but both of us. All those dreams we'd been building, all those conversations about names and schools and family traditions, it all felt so cruel and pointless. The doctors couldn't find anything specifically wrong with me, which somehow made it worse. At least if there had been a clear diagnosis, we could have made a plan or tried different treatments. Wayne and I had several long, painful conversations about what we wanted to do next. The doctor said we could keep trying, that there was no medical reason to think it would keep happening, but neither of us could handle the emotional roller coaster anymore. The hope followed by devastation was killing us both, and our relationship was starting to suffer under the weight of all that grief and disappointment. We made the mutual decision to stop trying, And while it felt like the right choice for our mental health, it also felt like we were giving up on this whole future we'd planned. Recovery from that decision took longer than I expected. Wayne threw himself into work, picking up extra projects and staying late at the office, while I tried to figure out what our life was supposed to look like now that kids weren't part of the picture. We'd been so focused on becoming parents that we'd kind of forgotten how to just be a married couple, and suddenly we had all this time and energy with nowhere to direct it. For a while, we tried to recapture what we'd had before, planning trips, trying new restaurants, picking up hobbies together, but there was this underlying sadness to everything. Like we were both just going through the motions of being happy. Wayne would suggest a weekend getaway, and I'd agree. But then we'd spend the whole time being politely considerate of each other instead of actually enjoying ourselves. It felt like we were both walking on eggshells, afraid that talking about the future would just remind us of everything we'd lost. The years that followed weren't terrible. Exactly. But they weren't great either. We settled into this routine of work and household maintenance and social obligations that felt more like being roommates than being married. Wayne would come home from work. We'd have dinner while watching TV, maybe discuss weekend plans or upcoming bills, and then we'd go to bed and do it all again the next day. We stopped having those long conversations about dreams and goals, stopped making plans that extended more than a few months out, stopped being curious about each other's inner lives. I kept waiting for something to shift, for one of us to suggest couples therapy or a big trip or some kind of change that would shake us out of this rut. But Wayne seemed content with our new normal. He'd gotten into this pattern of working longer hours and spending weekends on home improvement projects. And while he was never unkind or neglectful, he also wasn't really present in the way he used to be. I felt like I was living with a pleasant stranger who happened to share my last name and mortgage payments. By our 7th year of marriage, I was starting to feel genuinely invisible. Wayne would come home and give me a perfunctory kiss, hello, ask about my day while scrolling through his phone, and then disappear into his home office or the garage until dinner. We'd eat together but barely talk beyond logistics, whose turn it was to grocery shop. When we needed to schedule the HVAC maintenance, what we should get his parents for their anniversary. I couldn't remember the last time he'd asked me how I was feeling about something, or shared anything meaningful about his own thoughts or experiences. The loneliness was suffocating. I'd watch other couples at restaurants actually engaging with each other, laughing and leaning in close, and I'd feel this sharp pang of envy. When had Wayne and I stopped looking at each other like that? When had we stopped being curious about each other's thoughts and dreams? I started feeling like I was disappearing. Like I could probably not come home for 3 days, and Wayne wouldn't notice until he ran out of clean socks. That's when Marcus started paying attention to me at work. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just longer conversations at the coffee machine. Him actually listening when I talked about my weekend or my opinions on projects. He'd text me articles he thought I'd find interesting, or funny memes that reminded him of something I'd said. It was such a relief to feel seen and heard by someone, to remember what it felt like to have another person be genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences. I started looking forward to those text conversations in a way that probably should have been a red flag. But it felt so good to have someone eager to talk to me. Marcus would ask follow-up questions about things I'd mentioned days earlier. Remember details about my preferences and opinions? Make me feel like what I had to say actually mattered to someone. When Wayne would grunt responses to my attempts at conversation, I'd think about how Marcus had spent 20 minutes that day discussing a book recommendation I'd made, and the contrast was painful. I knew I was starting to emotionally invest in someone who wasn't my husband, but I justified it by telling myself that Wayne had emotionally checked out first. If he wanted to live like we were just friendly roommates who split bills, then why shouldn't I seek actual connection elsewhere? I wasn't doing anything physical, wasn't even flirting really. I was just talking to someone who treated me like I was worth talking to. The secretive phone behavior started gradually. I'd step outside to take Marcus's calls, or wait until Wayne was in the shower to respond to his texts. I told myself it was just because Wayne wouldn't understand the friendship, that he'd make it weird and complicated when it was really just two people enjoying each other's conversation. But I also knew that the amount of time and emotional energy I was investing in those conversations wasn't exactly appropriate for a married woman. Even if nothing physical was happening, Wayne noticed, of course. He started asking who I was texting so much, why I was always on my phone, why I kept stepping outside to take calls. His questions felt invasive and controlling, especially when he'd been perfectly happy to ignore me for months, until suddenly my attention was directed elsewhere. Where was this curiosity about my life when I was practically begging him to engage with me? Now that someone else found me interesting, suddenly Wayne wanted to know everything I was doing. That's when I started researching open marriages. Initially, it was just curiosity. I'd heard the term, but didn't really understand what it meant or how it worked. But the more I read, the more it started to make sense as a solution to our problems. All these articles and studies about how monogamy was this artificial construct that didn't align with human nature. How couples who opened their relationships often found renewed passion and honesty with each other. The research was fascinating. There were TED Talks about how sexual and emotional variety could actually strengthen primary partnerships. Podcasts featuring couples who credited open marriages with saving their relationships. Academic studies showing that consensual non-monogamy could increase communication and reduce resentment between partners. It wasn't just about sex, it was about growth and exploration, and not expecting one person to meet every single emotional and physical need. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this could be exactly what Wayne and I needed. We'd gotten stagnant and complacent, taking each other for granted instead of continuing to choose each other actively. If we were both free to explore connections with other people, maybe we'd remember what made our relationship special in the first place. Maybe Wayne would start appreciating what he had at home if he realized other people found me attractive and interesting. I spent weeks building my case, bookmarking articles and taking notes on the most compelling arguments. This wasn't some impulsive or selfish idea. This was a researched, thoughtful proposal for how we could revitalize our marriage and become better partners to each other. I genuinely believed that opening our relationship could help us rediscover what we'd lost and create space for the kind of growth and excitement that had been missing from our lives. When I finally brought it up to Wayne, I was nervous but confident in my presentation. I'd prepared for his likely objections and had thoughtful responses ready about communication and boundaries, and how this could ultimately bring us closer together. I explained how monogamy was this relatively recent social construct that didn't necessarily serve modern relationships, how we'd become stagnant and could benefit from the energy and perspective that new connections might bring. Wayne's initial reaction was exactly what I'd expected: confusion, concern, a lot of questions about what I was really asking for. But he didn't immediately shut down the conversation, which felt encouraging. He wanted to understand my reasoning, to see the research I'd been doing, to talk through what this would actually look like in practice. I could see him approaching it the same way he approached everything: methodically, analytically, wanting to understand all the variables before making a decision. I gave him space to process, which was torture but necessary. Wayne wasn't someone who made big decisions quickly, and I knew that pushing him would only make him more resistant to the idea. For a week, he asked thoughtful questions about boundaries and expectations, read through some of the articles I'd shared, and generally treated the whole thing like a complex problem that required careful consideration. When he finally agreed, I felt this rush of vindication and excitement. He wanted to establish clear rules and boundaries, which was so typically Wayne, but I appreciated that he was taking it seriously instead of just dismissing the whole idea. We spent an entire evening at the kitchen table, discussing what we were and weren't comfortable with, how we'd communicate about other relationships, what our expectations were for honesty and safety. The rules we established felt reasonable and fair. We'd both download dating apps, be upfront about being married and in an open relationship, prioritize sexual health and safety, and maintain open communication about any connections we made. Neither of us would bring other people to our home, and we'd check in regularly about how the arrangement was affecting our primary relationship. It felt mature and responsible, like we were two adults making a conscious choice to try something new together. We both downloaded Bumble and Tinder that same night, which felt surreal and exciting. I hadn't been on dating apps since before Wayne and I met, and the whole landscape had changed so much. Setting up my profile felt like this declaration of independence, like I was reclaiming some part of myself that had gotten lost in years of routine and complacency. I chose photos that showed me as confident and interesting, wrote a bio that was honest about my situation but emphasized what I was looking for in terms of connection and conversation. The first month was surprisingly quiet for both of us. We'd both browse our apps in the evenings, occasionally show each other funny profiles or weird messages, but neither of us was actively pursuing anything. It felt like we were both still adjusting to the idea, testing the waters without fully committing to the reality of actually meeting other people. I was getting matches and messages, but I found myself hesitating to respond or make concrete plans. Wayne seemed similarly cautious, which was reassuring in some ways but also slightly frustrating. Part of me had expected him to dive in immediately, to treat this like another project to tackle with his usual methodical enthusiasm. Instead, he seemed almost reluctant to engage, like he was going through the motions of having dating apps without really intending to use them. I started wondering if he was having second thoughts about the whole arrangement. That's when he matched with Brittany. She was 28, worked in marketing, had this bright smile, and seemed genuinely funny based on her profile. Wayne mentioned the match casually, said they'd been chatting and might meet for coffee sometime. I felt this weird flutter of anxiety mixed with excitement. This was what we'd agreed to. What I'd wanted? but seeing it become real was more complicated than I'd anticipated. Their first coffee date happened on a Saturday afternoon while I was getting my hair done. Wayne mentioned it that morning like it was any other errand he needed to run, which felt both appropriately casual and weirdly dismissive. I found myself checking my phone throughout my appointment, wondering how it was going, whether they were hitting it off, what they were talking about. When Wayne came home that evening, he seemed lighter somehow, more animated than I'd seen him in months. Over the next few weeks, Wayne continued seeing Brittany regularly. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates, and I could tell he was genuinely enjoying himself in a way that felt foreign after years of our routine interactions. He'd come home from their dates with stories about places they'd been, or things they'd talked about. And while he was being appropriately transparent about his activities, it was also painful to see him so engaged and enthusiastic about someone else. Wayne also started casually seeing 2 other women he'd met through the apps, Sarah, who was 32 and worked in nonprofit fundraising, and Amanda, who was 29 and taught middle school science. He was juggling these 3 different connections with the same organizational skills he brought to everything else, keeping track of their interests and schedules, planning thoughtful dates that played to their individual personalities. Watching him put so much effort into these new relationships highlighted how little effort he'd been putting into ours. The most frustrating part was how much happier Wayne seemed overall. He was more talkative at home, more interested in making plans together, more physically affectionate in casual ways. It was like having access to other people had reminded him how to be a person instead of just a functional adult going through the motions of daily life. I should have been happy that the arrangement was working the way I'd hoped it would, but instead I felt increasingly resentful. Meanwhile, my own dating life was basically non-existent. I'd gone on a few first dates that went nowhere, had some promising text conversations that fizzled out, but nothing that came close to the connections Wayne was making. The men I was meeting seemed either intimidated by my honesty about being married, or only interested in sex without any of the emotional connection I was craving. It felt deeply unfair that Wayne was thriving in this new arrangement while I was still feeling lonely and unfulfilled. The breaking point came when I saw Wayne and Brittany at brunch on a Sunday morning. I'd gone to meet a friend at this trendy place downtown, and there they were at a corner table, completely absorbed in each other's conversation. Wayne was laughing at something she'd said, leaning forward with this look of genuine delight that I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Brittany was beautiful in this effortless way, animated and confident, clearly enjoying Wayne's attention as much as he was enjoying hers. I watched them for probably 10 minutes, hidden behind my menu while my friend talked about her work drama. Wayne looked so relaxed and happy, so present in the moment in a way that made me realize how checked out he'd been at home for months. This was supposed to be about both of us exploring new connections, but somehow it had turned into Wayne having this whole rich social life, while I sat at home feeling more invisible than ever. When Wayne came home that afternoon, I was ready for a fight. All my careful research and reasonable arguments about open marriage had evaporated in the face of seeing him genuinely happy with someone else. I felt betrayed and humiliated, even though he was following exactly the rules we'd established together. The logical part of my brain knew I was being unfair, but the emotional part was screaming that this wasn't how things were supposed to go. So, you're out here dating children now? I asked him as soon as he walked through the door. Wayne looked genuinely confused, which made me even angrier. How could he not understand how inappropriate this was? How hurtful it was for me to see him parading around town with some 28-year-old like he was some kind of bachelor. Wayne tried to remind me that we'd agreed to this arrangement, that Brittany was hardly a child, that he'd been completely transparent about his activities. But I was beyond rational discussion at that point. This wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be one-sided. I thought he wouldn't even do it. Honestly, the whole point was supposed to be that I could explore other connections while Wayne stayed home, being his usual cautious, overthinking self. Wait, you wanted you to sleep around while I sat home like a chump? Wayne asked, and the hurt in his voice was infuriating. How could he make me sound like the villain here when he was the one who'd completely missed the point of what we were trying to do? This was supposed to help our marriage, not turn him into some kind of serial dater who thought he was hot stuff with women barely out of college. The fight escalated quickly from there. I accused Wayne of using our agreement as an excuse to cheat, of prioritizing his new girlfriends over working on our actual marriage, of being selfish and immature. Wayne kept trying to point out that he was following our rules, that I'd been the one to propose this arrangement, that he didn't understand what he was doing wrong. The more logical he was, the angrier I became. By the end of the night, we were both exhausted and hurt. Wayne had retreated to his usual pattern of trying to problem solve his way out of conflict, while I felt more unheard and misunderstood than ever. Nothing about this conversation had gone the way I'd hoped, and instead of addressing the real issues in our marriage, we just created new ones around this stupid open relationship experiment. The next morning, I suggested couples counseling. It felt like our last hope for getting back on track, for helping Wayne understand how his behavior was affecting me and our marriage. Maybe a neutral third party could help him see that what he was doing wasn't actually helping our relationship, that he was supposed to be working on us instead of building new relationships with other people. Wayne agreed to try therapy, which felt like a small victory. I spent the week before our first session thinking about what I wanted to say, how I could explain my perspective in a way that would help both Wayne and the therapist understand what had gone wrong. This whole open marriage thing had gotten out of hand, but maybe we could use counseling to reset and find a better way forward. Our first therapy session was frustrating, but not hopeless. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, was this calm, professional woman who let both of us tell our sides of the story without judgment. I explained how Wayne had completely misunderstood the point of opening our marriage, how he'd gotten carried away with dating other people instead of focusing on fixing our actual problems. Wayne talked about feeling confused and hurt by my anger, since he thought he'd been following our agreement. Dr. Martinez asked a lot of questions about our communication and expectations, and I could tell she was starting to understand how Wayne had missed the real point of what I'd been trying to accomplish. She suggested we schedule a follow-up session to dig deeper into our underlying relationship issues, which felt encouraging. Maybe with professional guidance, Wayne could finally understand what I'd been trying to tell him. The second therapy session was a disaster. Wayne came prepared with screenshots of our text conversations about the open marriage rules, like he was building some kind of legal case instead of trying to work on our relationship. When Dr. Martinez asked me directly whether I'd expected Wayne not to actually date other people, I tried to explain that the whole point was supposed to be theoretical, a way to open up conversations about what we weren't getting from each other. Yes, but I didn't think he'd actually do it, I finally admitted, and Dr. Martinez gave me this look like I'd just said something completely insane. She asked how I'd expected Wayne to interpret our agreement, what I thought would happen when we both downloaded dating apps, why I'd been upset about him following the rules we'd established together. The more questions she asked, the more defensive I became. It was like she and Wayne were ganging up on me, making me sound like some kind of manipulative villain when I'd been trying to save our marriage. I'd done all the research, put in all the emotional labor of trying to fix our problems. And somehow I was the bad guy because Wayne had taken everything too literally. I ended up walking out of that session because it was clear that neither Wayne nor Dr. Martinez understood what I'd actually been trying to accomplish. They were both so focused on the technical details of our agreement that they were missing the bigger picture about what our marriage actually needed. I felt completely misunderstood and unsupported, like I was the only one actually trying to work on our relationship. A week later, Wayne was served divorce papers at his office. I'd spent those 7 days thinking about everything that had happened, and it was clear that we were too far gone to fix this. Wayne had shown me exactly who he was and what he prioritized, and it wasn't our marriage. If he wanted to act like a single man, then he could be a single man. The divorce papers cited emotional cruelty and neglect, which felt like the most accurate description of what Wayne had put me through. He'd emotionally abandoned our marriage years ago, and then used my attempt to fix things as an excuse to openly cheat with multiple women. The fact that we technically agreed to an open relationship didn't change the underlying pattern of him prioritizing his own needs over our partnership. Wayne's reaction to the divorce papers was typically calm and analytical, which just confirmed that I was making the right decision. He didn't fight the divorce or try to win me back. He just hired his own attorney and started working through the legal process like it was another project to manage. The man I'd married would have fought for our relationship, but this stranger just wanted to divide assets and move on with his life. The court proceedings were exhausting and humiliating. Wayne's lawyer painted me as this unstable person who'd manipulated her husband into an open marriage and then punished him for participating. They made it sound like I was the one who destroyed our relationship, completely ignoring years of Wayne's emotional neglect and his inappropriate behavior with women barely out of college. Despite my legitimate grievances, the judge awarded us a straight 50-50 split of all our assets. Wayne didn't even react when the decision was read, while I couldn't help crying at the unfairness of it all. He was getting to walk away from 9 years of marriage with half of everything we'd built, plus his new girlfriend and his clear conscience, while I was left with nothing but the knowledge that I'd tried everything to save us. The process of dividing our belongings was awkward and painful. Wayne was methodical about it, creating spreadsheets and taking inventory, like he was managing a business transaction instead of dismantling a life we'd built together. He took his tools and electronics. I took most of the furniture and kitchen stuff, and we split the sentimental items with the efficiency of people who no longer shared any sentiment. After the divorce was finalized, Wayne blocked me on all social media platforms, which felt unnecessarily cruel. We'd been together for 11 years, married for 9, and he could just cut me out of his life completely, like I'd never mattered at all. I heard through mutual friends that he was still seeing Brittany, that his business was doing well, that he seemed happy and settled in his new life. I moved out of our city shortly after everything was settled. There were too many memories there, too many places where I might run into Wayne or his friends, or reminders of the life I'd tried so hard to save. I ended up going back to school to finish a degree I'd abandoned years earlier, which felt like a positive step forward, even though it wasn't how I'd planned to spend my 30s. The hardest part about everything that happened is how completely Wayne misunderstood what I was trying to do. I'd spent weeks researching ways to improve our marriage, had approached him with a thoughtful proposal for how we could grow together, and he'd turned it into this selfish opportunity to date other people. If he'd put half as much energy into working on our relationship as he'd put into planning dates with Brittany, we might still be together. I know people probably think I'm the villain in this story, but they don't understand the full context of what our marriage had become or how desperately I was trying to fix it. Wayne had emotionally checked out years before I ever suggested opening our relationship. And instead of seeing my proposal as an invitation to reconnect, he'd used it as permission to completely abandon any pretense of working on us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Wayne had understood what I was really asking for. If he'd seen the open marriage suggestion as a starting point for deeper conversations about what we both needed instead of a literal invitation to start dating other people. Maybe we could have found our way back to each other if he'd been willing to do the real work of rebuilding our connection instead of just following the technical rules we'd established. But Wayne was always more comfortable with concrete guidelines than emotional nuance. And I should have known that he'd approach an open marriage the same way he approached everything else, systematically and literally, without considering the underlying feelings and needs that had motivated my suggestion in the first place. By the time I realized how differently we'd interpreted our agreement, it was too late to course correct. I've heard that Wayne's consulting business is doing really well now, that he's making more money than he ever did as an employee, and has hired several people to help him manage all the work. I'm sure Brittany is very proud of his success, very supportive of his entrepreneurial dreams in ways that I apparently never was. It's funny how people can reinvent themselves so completely once they're free from the constraints of a marriage that wasn't working. My own life is quieter now, more focused on personal growth and figuring out what I actually want, instead of trying to fix relationships that are already broken. School is challenging but rewarding, and I'm building friendships with people who don't know anything about my failed marriage or the messy way it ended. There's something liberating about being able to start fresh, even though it's not the fresh start I would have chosen. I still think about those early years with Wayne sometimes, when we were genuinely happy and building something together. We had something real and valuable, and it's tragic that we couldn't find a way to recapture that connection when we both realized it was slipping away. But you can't save a marriage when only one person is willing to do the real work of understanding what went wrong and how to fix it.